Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're diving deep into something, well, pretty fundamental. It underpins almost every aspect of our lives. Money.
Yeah, absolutely. But we're not just talking about, the dollars in your pocket or the numbers in your bank account right now.
Exactly. We're going on a bit of an epic journey, actually, tracing money's surprising evolution, all the way from ancient favors right up to modern digital currencies.
And you've shared some really incredible sources with us today. It's a truly comprehensive look at financial systems, their history, where they are now, and maybe what might come next.
Right. So our mission in this deep dive is basically to pull out the most crucial insights, the real nuggets of knowledge from all this rich material.
We'll explore the fascinating forces that have shaped how we exchange value, who controls the ledger that's a key theme, and ultimately what that means for you, the individual, in what feels like an increasingly complex world.
Yeah, get ready for some, hopefully, aha moments and maybe some surprising facts because this is where it gets really interesting.
Okay, where do we start?
Let's go right back to the absolute beginning. Before coins, before even writing was widespread. Think about the simplest forms of exchange. It's all about these mental ledgers between friends and family.
Right, like the example you mentioned, Alice and her brother Bobby swapping chores. You cover mine today, I'll get yours tomorrow. That kind of thing.
Or even, colleagues in an office, just loosely keeping track of who drives for lunch. It's not about specific dollars or cents.
No, it's all built on trust and reputation. It's
Yeah.
a system of what some call informal gift credit. It works because you expect to interact with these people again.
But, and this is the crucial bit, that system kind of breaks down, doesn't it? When you're dealing with strangers, people you might never see again.
Exactly. That's where you hit the wall. The famous double coincidence of wants problem. You need to find someone who not only has the thing you want.
But they also have to want the specific thing you have to offer in return.
Yeah, it's a huge barrier to trade between groups that don't have that built-in trust.
So, okay, these early hunter-gatherer bands, they encounter strangers. How do they trade without that risk of, someone not paying back a favor later? What's the immediate fix?
Well, a natural first step was spot trading. Just finalize the transaction immediately. Get it done right then and there.
Makes sense. Like, you have spears, I have furs, we both need what the other has, we swap. Done.
Precisely. No lingering debt, no need for future promises. Both sides are better off immediately, and this desire for immediate settlement naturally leads towards the invention of something else.
Something that can work when trust isn't there.
Right. Commodity money. And for many early tribes, especially near coasts, shells were actually a pretty early answer.
Yes, shells.
Yeah.
Fascinating, serving as both money and status symbols.
Yeah, the sources talk about tribes on the Pacific coast of North America using those long, tooth-like dentalium shells. They were traded way inland, like as far as North Dakota.
And some tribes even had tattoos on their arms just from measuring strands of these shells, right?
That's right. And then on the Atlantic coast, you had wampum, made from clam shells.
Yeah.
A lot of work involved, polishing and drilling them.
Often ceremonial, used for treaties and stuff, but others, even the colonialists, started using them as actual money, too.
And if you go back even further, the oldest known beads, Blombos Cave, South Africa, we're talking 75,000 years ago.
Wow.
Tiny snail shells with holes, signs of wear. They were brought from 20 kilometers away, traces of red ochre on them. It's maybe the earliest form of storing information, storing value outside the human brain.
So why shells? What made them work so well back then?
Well, you could accumulate them, right? They boosted your social credit visually, and crucially, they worked with strangers, replacing that mental ledger. Plus, they were durable, pretty portable.
A way to save for the long term. Someone walking around covered in shell belts wasn't just fashionable.
No, they were literally wearing stored-up favors. It was a clear signal of status, of past success, or abundance.
But here's a twist, right? These early commodity money systems, they had a weakness.
A big one. They were vulnerable to technology. If someone showed up with better tools, better ways to find or make these things.
They could flood the market and devalue everyone else's savings.
Exactly. The stability was just about the object itself, but its resistance to being easily copied or produced in mass quantities. Its scarcity relative to the effort needed to get it.
Like the story from Yap Island with those huge ray stones, massive limestone discs.
Yeah. They had a high stock-to-flow ratio, meaning the existing supply was huge compared to the trickle of new stones being quarried and added. That made them valuable.
Until
Until an Irishman, David O'Keefe, showed up in the late 1800s. He had modern tools, ships, Better technology, basically. He could go to Palau, quarry massive stones relatively easily, and bring them back to Yap.
Flooding the market.
And becoming, as the sources say, the richest man on the island. Basically, by exploiting that technological advantage, he diluted the existing money supply.
A similar thing happened in Africa with trade beads, didn't it?
Absolutely. Europeans brought mass-produced glass beads, things they considered, fake valuables, and traded them for real valuables like ivory, gold, or slaves.
And tastes change too, right? So a bead that was valuable one year might not be the next. Not very fungible.
Exactly. Like the ray stones, the beads couldn't maintain their scarcity against technological progress from outsiders. Even intricate things like the Solomon Islands feather currency, beautiful, made from hundreds of tiny bird feathers.
But really only useful in a very small area. Limited fungibility, limited liquidity.
So out of all these experiments, all these different forms of early money, two metals eventually came out on top.
Gold and silver. They defeated all other commodity monies, as one source puts it. Why them?
Well, fundamentally, they held their value better against human ingenuity. They had a high enough stock-to-flow ratio that resisted technological dilution over centuries.
Think about gold. Most of the gold ever mined is apparently still around. It's practically indestructible, doesn't rust, you can melt it down and reshape it.
Exactly. Its chemical inertness and durability are key. And that high stock-to-flow is crucial. I mean, other things might be rarer, like rhodium, or maybe bits of meteorite.
But nobody accepts meteorite fragments for payment generally.
Right. They aren't widely accepted or liquid enough to function as money. Gold and silver combine rarity with those other essential qualities. Durable, portable, divisible, uniform, recognizable.
And this leads to the idea of a monetary premium.
Yeah. Gold and silver have value beyond just their industrial or decorative uses. People hold them as money, as savings, because they trust they'll hold value.
And that very demand, that premium, acts like a massive and permanent advertisement, as one source says, encouraging people to find or make more.
But only the truly scarce things can withstand that pressure over the long haul without being inflated away.
Like tobacco in colonial Virginia, it became money for a while.
Yeah, it acquired a monetary premium. But unlike gold, tobacco isn't naturally scarce. You can just grow more.
So people did, leading to production surges and massive price inflation when things were priced in tobacco.
Right. The colonial governments even tried to create artificial scarcity, limiting production, basically acting as tobacco money printers to prop up its value. But it was really hard to maintain.
It just shows that sustained natural scarcity is key for a stable commodity money.
Absolutely. Which brings us to a really interesting debate in economics about how money actually got started in the first place. The commodity theory versus the credit theory.
Okay, lay those out for us.
So the commodity theory, people like Adam Smith, Carl Menger, they argued money arises naturally to solve that barter problem, the double coincidence of wants. Find the most sellable good, and it becomes money.
And there was that fascinating example from the game Diablo 2.
Yeah. The Stone of Jordan ring. It was rare, useful in the game, everyone wanted it. It spontaneously became the currency for trading other items purely through player consensus.
Yep.
It gained a monetary premium.
Okay, so that's one view. What's the other?
The credit theory. Thinkers like Mitchell Enns and, more recently, David Graeber argued that money is fundamentally credit. They suggest flexible social credit systems, those favors we talked about, actually solve barter before specialized labor became widespread.
So, like, a baker gives bread to the butcher on the promise the butcher gives him meat later, and maybe that promise itself could be traded.
Exactly. These IOUs, these credits and debts, could circulate. Money emerges from these social relationships and record-keeping.
So how do we reconcile these? Both seem plausible.
Well, many argue both aspects are important. Credit might work well for everyday exchanges within a community. But what about specialized services? Like how many loaves of bread is brain surgery worth?
Right. You need a common unit of account for those things.
And historically, that unit of account was often linked to a valuable commodity, like a weight of silver or a measure of grain, even if the day-to-day transactions were happening on credit. The commodity anchored the value of the credit.
Mitchell Ennis also had a point about debasement, right? He didn't think rulers just arbitrarily messed with the currency.
He argued it was often driven by necessity, like war or plague disrupting the economy. But what's really fascinating, and maybe a blind spot for him, is how the ability to debase money could actually increase the likelihood of war.
How so?
Well, if a ruler can fund a war by gradually reducing the silver content in coins, instead of imposing unpopular taxes up front, It makes the cost less visible, less immediate to the public. It makes starting and sustaining conflicts easier.
That's a powerful insight, hiding the cost through inflation.
Yeah. And David Graeber also observed something interesting. Credit systems seem to flourish during periods of peace and social trust,
Makes sense. You trust people will honor their debts.
whereas precious metals become preferred during times of widespread war and plunder when trust breaks down. You want something tangible, universally accepted, not just a promise from someone you might never see again or who might not be around tomorrow.
So when trust is high, ledgers work. When trust is low, hard money works.
That's a pretty good summary. And eventually these trust-based systems started getting formalized.
Like in ancient Babylon.
Exactly. The Code of Hammurabi, nearly 4,000 years ago, it had specific laws for loans, interest rates, formalized weights and measures, even written credit contracts.
Then much later on the Silk Road, you had things like the Suftaja.
Right, starting around the 8th century. These were basically letters of credit used by Muslim and Jewish merchants. Precursors existed even earlier in Egypt.
What was the point?
Avoid carrying large amounts of physical coin over dangerous routes. Prevent theft, increase efficiency. You'd give money to a merchant in one city, get a note, and redeem it with their partner in another city.
And there were also hawaladars.
Yeah, professional money dealers who operated within a reputation-based network. They could transfer funds between locations purely based on trust and balancing their internal books, often without any money physically moving long distances.
Incredible systems built on trust and reputation. And then a huge leap forward with accounting.
Double-entry bookkeeping. Luca Pacioli gets credit for codifying it in 1494, the father of accounting. But the basic ideas were around earlier, in Italy, maybe influenced by Islamic merchants and Indian numeral systems.
How did that revolutionize things?
It gave businesses and banks a much clearer picture of their financial health assets, liabilities, profit, loss. It was fundamental to the rise of more complex commerce and banking.
Okay, so let's talk about that rise of banking and how it led towards the systems we have today, moving away from physical commodities.
Well, early banks provided a huge convenience. Merchants didn't need to lug around heavy bags of coins or store them securely. They could deposit their gold or silver.
And the bank just updated its ledger.
Exactly. And maybe gave the merchant paper notes representing that deposit. This abstraction made gold much more portable and liquid, easier to transact with. It's like a paper version of the internet for value transfer.
But it introduced a new kind of risk, didn't it?
Absolutely. Counterparty risk. The risk that the bank might not actually have the gold to back up those paper notes when you wanted to redeem them, or that they might fail altogether.
And modern banks take this abstraction even further. They leverage deposits, right? They lend out more money than they actually hold in reserves.
Typically, yeah.
Yeah.
5 to 10 times leverage. And most of their reserves aren't physical cash anymore, but digital entries at a central bank.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, if there's a run on a bank,
The central bank can step in and create more base money, injecting liquidity into that bank or the system. But the cost is potentially diluting the value of everyone else's money in the process.
which brings us back to that key question. Who controls the ledger in this modern system?
It's layered. Individual banks control their customer ledgers, their subledgers. But the government, through the central bank and regulations, has significant control over the full ledger.
They can order accounts frozen or even confiscated for whatever reason they deem necessary, just, or unjust. That's a lot of power.
It is. And the history of the U.S. dollar shows this trend towards centralization pretty clearly.
After the Revolutionary War and the hyperinflation of the Continentals,
People wanted stable money. So the Coinage Act of 1792 established the silver dollar as the base unit, backed by metal.
but before the Federal Reserve, banking was more decentralized. The free banking era.
Yeah, states regulated individual banks. These banks issued their own banknotes, often backed by various assets like state bonds. But the system was fragile. Limited branching meant banks couldn't easily diversify risks, so bank runs were common.
And the global trend, not just in the U.S., has been steadily towards more centralization in banking.
Definitely. And a key moment for government oversight, particularly regarding privacy, was the Bank Secrecy Act of 1970 in the U.S.
That's the one requiring reporting transactions over $10,000.
Right. And crucially, that $10,000 threshold was never indexed to inflation. So over 50 years, as inflation eroded the dollar's value, that fixed number meant more and more routine transactions fell under surveillance without any new laws being passed. It was a slow expansion of monitoring.
Wow. So this idea of a central clearinghouse, W. Stanley Jevons described London that way back in 1875.
Yeah, he saw it as the hub where all the world's financial claims could be netted out against each other. Efficient, centralized.
But that efficiency, that abstraction away from physical gold, was exploited massively during World War I, wasn't
That
it?
was a huge turning point. Governments needed vast sums to fund the war. Instead of raising taxes drastically, they leaned on their central banks.
And the banks secretly printed enormous amounts of new currency, issuing bonds supposedly backed by gold, but the gold backing was becoming increasingly thin?
Exactly. They broke the link. British household savings, held in pounds sterling, lost over half their purchasing power during that period due to this hidden inflation.
The Financial Times even had to issue a correction, like a century later, for reporting that war bonds were oversubscribed when they weren't.
Yeah, and our sources call this the only time in history where, on a global scale, a weaker money won out in terms of adoption over a harder money.
Why did fiat win then? Why did people accept paper over gold?
Speed and convenience, primarily driven by new technologies like the telegraph and telephone. Fiat currency, transmitted electronically or via paper, was just faster and easier to use for global trade and finance than physically moving gold.
Plus, governments made it mandatory, right? Legal tender laws. You had to accept it for payments and taxes.
That solidified its position. But it represented, as John Maynard Keynes pointed out, a tremendous power shift from those who use the ledger to those who control the ledger.
Because the promise backing the paper could just be severed.
Overnight, the nature of money fundamentally changed. Control shifted decisively to nation-states and their central banks.
Then after World War II, we got the Bretton Woods system, trying to bring back some stability.
Right. The U.S. dollar was pegged to gold, at least for foreign central banks who could redeem dollars for gold. And other major currencies were pegged to the dollar. It worked reasonably well for about 25 years.
Until 1971, Nixon closed the gold window, and the world entered a completely new era.
Unprecedented, really. An era of purely unbacked fiat currencies floating against each other.
How did the dollar maintain its global dominance after that?
Well, the U.S. used its considerable economic and military clout. A key move was convincing Saudi Arabia and other major oil producers, OPEC, to price oil exclusively in U.S. dollars.
The petrodollar system.
Exactly. And not only price oil in dollars, but also hold their surplus oil revenues in U.S. Treasury bonds. This created a huge artificial global demand for dollars, effectively backing the dollar with oil, or rather the need to acquire dollars to buy oil.
So countries like South Korea and Saudi Arabia, when they trade oil, they don't need to trust each other's currency or ledger.
They just need to trust the U.S. dollar ledger, held primarily within the U.S. banking system and its connections like SWIFT.
And this gives the U.S. enormous geopolitical leverage, doesn't it?
Immense leverage. Our sources explain how the dollar's strength or weakness can be used strategically. A strong dollar hurts developing nations that have borrowed in dollars. Their debts become harder to repay.
While a weak dollar hurts countries holding large dollar reserves, like China or Japan, eroding the value of their savings.
Right, and the U.S. can influence policy through institutions like the IMF, where loans often come with conditions like currency devaluation. Or look at France's ongoing influence over the CFA franc zone in Africa, requiring former colonies to hold reserves in the French treasury. It raises big questions about power dynamics and fairness in the long run.
Some sources argue this system even contributes to what they call imperial decay. How?
By allowing the U.S., for example, to run persistent large trade deficits without the natural corrective market pressure it might otherwise face, the global demand for dollars props it up.
And it allows for financing huge expenditures, like the war on terror estimated $5.8 trillion by 2022 through opaque money creation rather than direct taxation.
Yeah, abstracting the true costs from the public. Some argue this benefits connected industries while potentially hollowing out the domestic industrial base over time as production moves elsewhere.
So, looking at the modern financial system as a whole, our sources suggest it has some, let's say, built-in issues or design flaws.
One major point is that it seems designed for continuous money supply inflation, a slow, steady debasement,
And this subtly siphons purchasing power away from regular savers.
towards those closer to the money printer, the so-called arbitrageurs.
Yeah.
Large financial institutions, well-connected corporations, those who get access to new credit or funds first, before that new money circulates and pushes up prices for everyone else.
The argument is that it rewards size and connections and often shifts private sector losses onto the public balance sheet during crises, suppressing volatility for a while until it blows up bigger later.
Right, so let's clarify who actually creates money in this system. It's not just one entity.
Okay. Who are the players?
Well, commercial banks are key. They create most of the new money we use day to day, what economists call broad money, the deposits in our accounts. They do this whenever they make a loan.
They don't just lend out existing deposits.
No, lending creates new deposits. They leverage their reserves. It's kind of providing the illusion of liquidity over an underlying base of less liquid reserves.
Okay, so banks create broad money. What about the Federal Reserve, the central bank?
The Fed primarily controls base money. That's the physical currency in circulation, plus the digital reserves commercial banks hold at the Fed. The Fed increases base money mainly by buying assets, like government bonds. This is quantitative easing, or QE.
But that doesn't automatically mean more money in consumers' pockets, right?
Not directly. It gives banks more reserves, more capacity to lend, but it doesn't force them to lend. It's often called money printing of base money. But its direct impact on the broader economy is debated and depends on what banks do next.
And the U.S. Treasury. When the government runs a deficit and spends money.
That's mostly moving existing money around. The government borrows money, selling bonds, and spends it. It takes capital from one area, bond buyers, and injects it elsewhere. This can have a crowding out effect on private investment, but isn't typically considered money printing in the same way as the Fed creating reserves or banks creating deposits via loans.
But there's a scenario where it becomes highly inflationary.
Yes. The most potent combination, according to the sources, is when the Treasury runs large fiscal deficits, and the Federal Reserve simultaneously buys up the debt issued to fund those deficits, QE.
So deficit spending combined with QE.
Exactly. This directly increases both base money, Fed reserves, and broad money, government deposits flowing into consumer business accounts, bypassing the bank's lending decisions. This can pump money directly into the economy very quickly and has, as the sources warn, potentially no limit other than triggering runaway inflation.
Wow. Okay, so central banks often talk about aiming for price stability, usually around 2% inflation per year.
Right. They see that as a healthy target.
Mhm.
But critics, like the economist Friedrich Hayek, emphasize that prices aren't just numbers to be kept stable. They're vital signals.
Signals about what?
About scarcity and abundance. Prices coordinate economic activity. High prices signal scarcity, encouraging conservation and motivating producers to make more. Low prices signal abundance.
The gasoline pipeline analogy is good here. If a pipeline breaks, gas prices should shoot up, right?
Yes, that signals the shortage. It encourages people to drive less, maybe find alternatives, and motivates companies to fix the pipeline faster or ship gas in from elsewhere.
But if politicians impose price caps to keep prices low,
It can actually prolong the shortage. It masks the signal, reduces the incentive to conserve, and blunts the market forces trying to solve the problem. Central planners, our sources argue, simply can't replicate the complex information processing done by millions of individuals responding to price signals.
so constant inflation, even low inflation, messes with this signaling mechanism. It's like using a shrinking ruler, as one source puts it.
Exactly. It makes long-term planning hard for businesses and individuals. How do you save for retirement if your measuring stick keeps changing? It favors debtors over creditors, and those who can adjust their prices or wages quickly over those who can't.
Like in Egypt, mentioned in the sources, with multiple devaluations since 2016, wage earners are constantly playing catch-up, trying to negotiate higher pay just to maintain their standard of living.
Yeah, it creates uncertainty and churn, but it's crucial to distinguish this kind of monetary inflation from beneficial price deflation.
Right, like when technology makes things cheaper. TVs, computers, electronics.
That's good deflation. It reflects productivity gains. We get more for less. The problem is when the money itself loses value across the board.
And that inflation doesn't affect everything equally, does it?
Not at all. The U.S. broad money supply grew massively between 1913 and 2022, over 1,100 times, about 6.6% compounded annually.
So where did that money go? Or rather, how did prices react?
The scarcest assets think unique waterfront property. Rare art, they tend to keep pace or exceed that monetary expansion. Semi-scarce things like gold, oil, maybe typical homes, they might rise 4 or 5% annually over the long term.
Well, things that are easy to produce more of.
Electronics, clothes, mass-produced goods, they see low or even negative price inflation because technological improvements constantly make them cheaper to produce, offsetting the monetary debasement.
Which leads to that disconnect, like the Fed official in 2011 saying cheaper iPads offset rising food costs.
Yeah, that comment didn't land well. because for most people, the cost of essential goods and services rising faster than their wages is a much bigger deal than non-essentials getting cheaper. It highlights how inflation hits different groups differently.
And this persistent inflation, where money supply growth outpaces interest rates you can earn on savings.
It creates a strong incentive not to hold cash. Why save money if it's guaranteed to lose value?
So people are pushed into buying other assets, stocks, bonds, real estate, collectibles, anything scarce.
Exactly. It distorts capital allocation. Money flows into preserving wealth in scarce assets, rather than potentially more productive investments. It can contribute to asset bubbles and make basic necessities, like housing, unaffordable as they become speculative investment vehicles.
This sounds like the Cantillon effect.
Precisely. It describes how new money enters the economy unevenly. Those who receive it first, governments, large banks, defense contractors, politically connected firms, get to spend it at current prices.
Before it circulates more widely and bids prices up for everyone else.
Right, so it acts as a less transparent kind of bottom-up wealth redistribution mechanism. It also relates to differential access to credit.
How so?
Well, individuals or small businesses struggling often face very high interest rates, credit cards, payday loans, while wealthy individuals or large corporations can borrow cheaply, using assets as collateral or accessing public markets.
And selective bailouts exacerbate this.
The sources argue yes. Look at 2008. Big banks got cheap government loans, allowing them to buy distressed assets at bargain prices, effectively socializing their losses. Meanwhile, homeowners facing foreclosure got comparatively little direct aid.
Or the 2020 Paycheck Protection Program, PPP.
While it undoubtedly helped many struggling businesses survive, the structured loans that mostly became grants also ended up benefiting, in some cases, wealthy owners of profitable firms who perhaps didn't face existential risk. Airline bailouts often rewarded companies that had taken on excessive debt and bought back stock, rather than those that had managed more prudently. Risk was transferred to the taxpayer.
So the argument is this whole structure tends to centralize wealth and influence over time toward those that control those larger entities.
With the federal government ultimately at the apex of that structure.
And all this accumulation of debt, public and private, ties into the idea of the long-term debt cycle.
Yeah, debt tends to grow exponentially over decades, often faster than the underlying economy. Eventually, the burden becomes unsustainable, leading to what our sources call inevitable financial resets.
These have happened throughout history.
Oh yes, Babylonian kings periodically declared clean slates, forgiving consumer debts to prevent social unrest. Solon in ancient Athens implemented debt relief, the Sisyphea, to stave off revolution.
And more recently.
The U.S. in the 1930s and 40s. Huge public debt from the Depression and WWII was effectively dealt with through a combination of economic growth, inflation, and financial repression, holding interest rates artificially low, so inflation could erode the real value of the debt.
So we have these long cycles, but also shorter ones?
Right, the regular business cycle. Expansions fuel debt growth, optimism turns to speculation, then a contraction hits. But in recent decades, policymakers have consistently stepped in to prevent deep contractions.
Lowering interest rates, injecting liquidity.
Bailouts.
The 1987 crash, LTCM in 98, the dot-com bust in 2000, the 2008 housing crisis.
Each time, the response involved preventing widespread defaults and liquidations. Excess credit, the argument goes, was never allowed to clear naturally, leading to ever higher debt levels building up in the system.
How is the 2020-21 response different from 2008?
It's a crucial distinction. In 2008, the main response was a surge in base money, the Fed bailing out banks to prevent a collapse of the payment system, and a deflationary spiral where broad money would actually shrink. It mostly stayed within the financial system.
But in 2020-21,
we saw a massive surge in broad money. This was driven by huge government fiscal deficits, stimulus checks, enhanced unemployment benefits directly financed by the Fed buying the resulting debt, QE.
So money went directly into people's and businesses' bank accounts.
Exactly. Which is why it led directly to significant consumer price inflation, unlike the 2008 response, which mainly reflated asset prices.
So where does that leave us now, according to the sources?
In a tricky spot. Very high sovereign debt levels globally. Significant wealth concentration, fueling social and political tension. A shift towards a more multipolar world challenging the dollar's dominance. And voters often wanting contradictory things, lower taxes, and more government spending.
Which implies more debt. How does this usually resolve?
Historically, high government debt levels like this are often resolved through inflation, default restructuring, or some combination thereof. The path of least resistance is often inflation, eroding the debt's real value over time.
Okay, so that paints a challenging picture for the current system, which naturally leads to the idea of alternatives. Stateless money.
Yeah, it's an idea that's been around. Friedrich Hayek, the Nobel laureate economist, wrote back in 1984 that he didn't think we'd see good money again until we take the thing out of the hands of government.
But he thought it couldn't be done by force. It needed a...
A sly, roundabout way that governments can't stop. Something based on technology.
And the technological groundwork started being laid in the 90s and early 2000s.
Right. Ideas around digital scarcity. Adam Back's Hashcash in 1997 used proof of work to combat email spam. Nick Sambo conceptualized BitGold. Hal Finney developed reusable proof of work in 2004.
But these were still centralized, right? They needed a trusted server or issuer.
That was the key problem they couldn't quite solve. Decentralization.
Yeah.
Until 2008,
Enter Satoshi Nakamoto.
whoever he, she, or they were, published the Bitcoin white paper, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system, and launched the network in early 2009.
And that first block, the Genesis block, had that embedded message, a nod to the context.
Yeah, direct quote from the Times newspaper headline. The Times 03 Jan 2009 Chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks. A pretty clear statement of intent, wouldn't you say?
Definitely seems pointed. And Satoshi vanished around 2010.
Yeah, stepped away, leaving the open source project to the community,
Sure.
which is arguably crucial for its decentralization. No central leader or point of failure.
So how does Bitcoin function differently, like compared to Jevons' centralized clearinghouse vision?
It aims to be a decentralized global clearinghouse. It allows for direct peer-to-peer settlement of a digital bearer asset, the Bitcoin itself, typically within minutes, anywhere in the world.
No intermediaries needed, no reliance on traditional banks or payment networks.
Not for base layer transactions. The blockchain, this shared public ledger, acts as the settlement layer. It's designed to be an immutable and decentralized database.
And its early uses really highlighted its potential for censorship resistance.
Absolutely. WikiLeaks was one of the first high-profile examples. When PayPal, Visa, MasterCard cut them off from donations,
They turned to Bitcoin.
and the donations flowed. It showed Bitcoin could function as censorship-resistant money. We saw similar things with Alexei Navalny's opposition movement in Russia, using it when their bank accounts were frozen.
Nigerians protesting police brutality used it when the government froze activists' accounts.
Yeah, and beyond political dissent, people use it to circumvent capital controls like in China, to escape hyperinflation like in Venezuela, or just persistent high inflation in places like Lebanon, Argentina, Turkey.
And for financial inclusion, people without access to traditional banks.
That's another key use case. Remote workers in Africa getting paid directly in Bitcoin without high intermediary fees. And the story of Roya Mahbub paying Afghan women programmers in Bitcoin.
Giving them direct control over their earnings, which male relatives couldn't just confiscate as they might with cash. That's powerful.
It really is. But okay, a common question is scaling. Bitcoin's base layer can only handle so many transactions per second, right? Around 400,000 per day globally.
Which isn't enough for global commerce if everyone used it for everything.
Correct. Which is why development focuses heavily on layer 2 solutions and sidechains, built on top of Bitcoin's secure base layer.
Like the Lightning Network.
That's probably the most well-known. It uses smart contracts, basically, 2 of 2 multi-signature channels, to allow potentially millions of near-instant, very low-fee transactions off the main blockchain.
Like opening a bar tab. You make lots of small payments on the tab.
And only settle the final balance on the main blockchain when you close the tab or channel. It makes micropayments feasible, paying tiny amounts for data, streaming content, maybe even AI services or machine-to-machine payments in the future.
What other layers are there?
There's the Liquid Network, which is a federation, a group of trusted companies that allows for faster, more private Bitcoin transactions and issuance of other assets. It trades off some decentralization for efficiency.
Fediment.
That enables community-based banking on Bitcoin using federated Show-me-in mints for privacy. And you have platforms like RSK and Stacks bringing more complex smart contract capabilities to Bitcoin.
So the ecosystem is evolving, but what about the energy consumption criticism? It gets brought up constantly.
It does, and often based on misunderstandings or outdated projections. Remember that World Economic Forum prediction from 2017 that Bitcoin would consume all the world's energy by 2020?
Yeah, that didn't exactly happen.
Not even close. Bitcoin uses a fraction of 1% of global energy. But the key point isn't just the amount, it's how and why it uses energy.
Okay, explain the miner's role. They process transactions and secure the network.
Right. They compete to solve a complex mathematical problem. The winner gets to add the next block of transactions to the blockchain and receives a reward. Newly created Bitcoins, the block subsidy, which halves roughly every 4 years, plus the transaction fees from that block.
And this computational race requires energy, proof of work.
Yes, but it's not really accurate to talk about energy per transaction. The network's energy use is more like a baseline security cost, like a fortress wall. Its cost is largely fixed, whether one person or a million people are inside. Adding more transactions doesn't proportionally increase the energy cost significantly.
And where do miners get their energy? Are they just burning fossil fuels?
Some do, but the economics strongly incentivize miners to find the cheapest possible energy sources. And often, the cheapest energy is stranded or wasted energy.
What do you mean by stranded?
Energy that's produced in remote locations, with no easy way to get it to consumers. Think natural gas being flared off at oil wells because building a pipeline isn't economical. Or excess hydroelectric power generated at night when demand is low.
So Bitcoin miners can set up shop right next to these sources.
Exactly. They're mobile, they can go to the energy source, they act as an energy buyer of last resort. This can actually make previously uneconomic energy projects viable, like small hydro dams.
So they can help stabilize grids by absorbing excess power.
That's the argument. They provide a flexible load that can turn on or off quickly, helping grid operators manage supply and demand. The sources describe miners as potentially huge technological upgrades for energy infrastructure, particularly in developing regions, like that company Gridless in East Africa, building hydro and using mining to fund it, creating jobs and infrastructure.
That flips the narrative quite a bit. Okay, let's talk about Bitcoin's design itself. Adam Back, the Hashcash inventor, had some insights here.
Yeah, he described Bitcoin as existing in a very narrow pocket of design space, meaning if you try to improve one aspect, you often have to sacrifice something else.
Trade-offs.
Big ones. Bitcoin's core design choices heavily prioritize security and decentralization above almost everything else.
Like transaction speed. If you make blocks bigger or faster to process more transactions.
It generally makes it harder and more expensive for average users to run their own full node to verify the entire blockchain themselves. That pushes validation towards larger, more capitalized entities, increasing centralization risk.
What about privacy?
Enhancing privacy on the base layer often means sacrificing auditability, the ability for anyone to verify the total supply and transaction history. So privacy is often handled on layers built on top, like Lightning.
Code expressivity, making the base layer do more complex smart contracts.
Increases complexity, which means a larger attack surface for bugs and exploits. It can also centralize aspects like block construction. Bitcoin keeps its base layer script relatively simple and robust for this reason.
And the big one, proof of work versus proof of stake energy use.
This is a fundamental debate. Proof of work uses external energy expenditure as the anchor for truth. It creates unforgeable costliness. To rewrite the blockchain, you'd need to respend all that energy, making attacks incredibly expensive. It ties digital consensus to physical reality.
Whereas proof of stake
Relies on existing coin holders, stakers, to validate transactions. Your voting power depends on how much stake you have. Proponents say it's more energy efficient.
but critics worry about.
Circular validation. The rich get richer, and control potentially concentrates among large stakeholders. If a cartel of powerful validators colludes to censor transactions or rewrite history, our sources argue it might be harder to detect and reverse than a proof-of-work attack, which leaves an undeniable energy footprint. They sometimes call PAL-tax check, reversible, and PAL-tax censorship checkmate, potentially permanent if the validators control the consensus.
So Bitcoin's design is conservative, prioritizing long-term stability like fundamental internet protocol.
Exactly. Like TCP/IP or Ethernet foundational protocols built decades ago, but still underpinning everything. Bitcoin aims for that kind of endurance, with upgrades happening carefully, often through soft forks that maintain backward compatibility.
And this focus on stability and user control enables monetary self-sovereignty.
That's the ideal, yes. Because the code is open source, relatively simple to audit, and crucially, developers cannot force changes onto the network. Each individual node operator chooses whether or not to run updated software. It puts the ultimate control, in theory, with the users. Though achieving perfect self-sovereignty is probably an asymptotic goal, something you approach but never fully reach.
And finally, adoption. Gresham's law, bad money drives out good.
Yeah, people tend to spend the currency they expect to depreciate, fiat, and save the one they expect to appreciate, like Bitcoin, for those who believe in it. The theory is, as more people hold Bitcoin, as it becomes more liquid and integrated into the financial system, its volatility should decrease. potentially allowing it to capture a larger share of global assets, currently held in things like gold, bonds, or even real estate.
Okay, so that's the potential future offered by decentralized money. But governments and central banks are exploring their own digital future, aren't they? Central bank digital currencies, CBDCs.
Yes, this is a major development being actively researched or piloted in many countries.
What's the main motivation, according to our sources?
A big driver seems to be enhancing monetary policy toolkits, specifically overcoming the zero lower bound on interest rates.
Meaning?
Right now, it's hard to push interest rates significantly below zero because people can just choose to hold physical cash instead, which has a 0% nominal yield. If you eliminate physical cash and replace it with a digital-only currency,
You could potentially implement deeply negative interest rates, forcing people to spend rather than save during recessions.
that appears to be one major goal cited by proponents within central banks. Discourage hoarding, stimulate spending.
Have we seen any real-world attempts yet?
Nigeria launched the e-naira in 2021. Adoption was initially very low. The central bank then imposed sharp limits on physical cash withdrawals to try and force people onto the digital platform.
How did that go?
Ironically, our sources suggest it pushed many Nigerians towards other cryptocurrencies, like Bitcoin, that offered more user control. European officials are also discussing CBDCs, sometimes mentioning the need for limited amounts of control over digital euros, often citing terrorism financing or money laundering as justifications.
So from a state's perspective, what's the appeal of a CBDC?
Control. Our sources argue CBDCs could offer unprecedented levels of oversight and control over financial activity, potential for enhanced surveillance, programmability, money that expires or can only be spent on certain things, and the ability to instantly freeze or seize funds.
Proponents usually frame it as improving accessibility, efficiency, and law enforcement.
Which may be true to some extent. But critics, highlighted in our sources, worry that these same features could be used to suppress dissent, enforce social conformity, or exert fine-grained control over citizens' lives in ways currently impossible.
This ties directly into broader concerns about the surveillance state, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Privacy is recognized as a human right, Article 12 of the Universal Declaration. Yet it feels increasingly under threat.
From corporate surveillance, Google, Facebook, tracking everything.
To credit bureaus like Equifax suffering massive breaches, government surveillance programs like NSA's PRISM, spyware like Pegasus being used against activists and journalists, privacy is becoming harder to maintain.
And governments often justify expanding surveillance powers by invoking
The war on something, war on drugs, war on terror, war on trafficking. Critics argue these are often used as justifications to erode privacy protections, creating a climate where simply wanting privacy is treated as suspicious behavior.
What's the potential endpoint if these trends continue, according to some analyses?
A potentially dystopian future. Combining automated mass data collection with centralized control over digital money could enable things like China's social credit system on a wider scale. Maybe CO2 emission quotas tied to your spending, accounts frozen for attending protests. Orwellian scenarios.
But there's a counter-movement, right, an asymmetric defense.
Yes, the idea of code as speech and the power of decentralized technologies. Think of the printing press. It broke the monopoly on information held by the church and state, enabling the Reformation and Enlightenment. Decentralized communication and financial tools could have a similar impact today.
The cypherpunks were early pioneers here. Eric Hughes's manifesto in 1993.
Declared that privacy is necessary for an open society in the electronic age, and that privacy is the power to selectively reveal oneself to the world. They advocated for using strong cryptography and anonymous transaction systems to protect individual liberty.
Hughes famously wrote, "Cypherpunks write code."
We know that code can't be destroyed, and a widely dispersed system can't be shut down.
And there's legal precedent supporting this idea that software code is protected speech.
Yes, battles fought over things like Phil Zimmerman's PGP encryption software in the 90s helped establish that. People printed the source code on T-shirts to protest export restrictions. The point is, information, including code, is very hard to suppress once it's out there.
And we're seeing this play out in the real world now, people using these tools.
Definitely. We mentioned human rights activists using Bitcoin to bypass financial censorship in places like Nigeria or Russia. The Canadian trucker protests were another example. When bank accounts were frozen by the government, crypto donations became a crucial alternative lifeline. It demonstrated the practical value of non-state, censorship-resistant money.
It echoes warnings like Eisenhower's about the military-industrial complex, the danger of powerful, centralized institutions potentially overriding individual liberties.
Right. And people like Alex Gladstein at the Human Rights Foundation or Elizabeth Stark at Lightning Labs are actively working on developing and promoting these open source monetary technologies, specifically as tools for human rights and financial freedom, as highlighted in our source material.
Looking at the bigger picture, our sources note a concerning trend. Global freedom metrics have actually been declining since around 2005.
And they argue that the malfunctioning global financial system plays a significant role in this. The pressures from the long-term debt cycle, the wealth concentration fueled by inflation and bailouts, the geopolitical shifts, these all create instability, erode trust, and can fuel populism and authoritarian tendencies.
So it brings us back full circle to that fundamental question. Who controls the ledger?
It's the thread running through this entire history. Control shifted from local communities and the laws of nature, scarcity, to empires with better technology, then to banks abstracting commodity money, and finally to nation-states and central banks controlling fiat ledgers via telecommunications. Now, the emergence of digital scarcity and digital settlement, primarily through Bitcoin, potentially opens a new chapter, an opening for a new monetary era, where control might shift again, possibly back towards decentralization, towards the individual. But it's an ongoing contest.
So after this incredible journey through millennia of financial evolution, what does this all mean for you listening right now?
We've seen this constant push and pull, haven't we?
Yeah.
Between centralization and decentralization, between the convenience and power that comes with control and the fundamental need for individual liberty and autonomy.
We've seen how subtle changes in the monetary system, like the ability to debase currency, can lead to massive, often hidden transfers of wealth, and how technology is constantly reshaping who holds the reins of financial power.
Yeah, if we really connect this to the bigger picture, it forces you to ask some important questions. In a world where financial power seems increasingly concentrated and where privacy feels like it's eroding, how much real control do you actually have over your own economic life, your destiny?
And what role might these new decentralized technologies play? Will they be a way to reclaim some of that control? Or perhaps redefine what control even means in a digital age?
This deep dive really makes it clear, doesn't it? Understanding money isn't just about spreadsheets and interest rates.
Not at all. It's fundamentally about freedom, about power structures, and really about the future of how human societies organize themselves.
Definitely something to mull over until our next deep dive.